Welcome to Phoenix Masonry Live,
a show about Masonic museum artifacts,
interviews,
Masonic history,
and much more.
I am Frederick L. Milliken, Executive Director of Phoenix Masonry.
And I am Mason Pratt, Webmaster at Phoenix Masonry.
And we are here to
celebrate
our Freemasonry. And that's what we do here at Phoenix Masonry. We celebrate our Freemasonry. And today, we are celebrating with Masonic author, Brother Chuck Dunning. Welcome to the show, Chuck.
Thank you, Brother Fred, Brother Mason. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation this evening.
Welcome also. All right. Chuck Dunning has been a Master Mason since 1988, and his mother lodge is Haltom City, Riverside, number 1331, in Haltom City, Texas. He is also a member of Albert Pike, number 162 in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and also belongs to a number of Masonic research societies. In the Scottish Rite, Chuck is the Knight Commander of the Court of Honor, Director of Education for the Guthrie Valley in Oklahoma, and a class director for the Fort Worth Valley in Texas. In 2012, he became the founding superintendent of the Academy of Reflection, which is a chartered organization for the Scottish Rite Masons, wanting to integrate
contemplative
practice with their Masonic experience.
He has been engaged in various forms of contemplative practice for over 3 decades. In his career in higher education and mental health, in Masonry, and with other groups and individuals. He facilitates and teaches mindfulness, meditation, and imagery to enhance people's experiences of life in many ways. Chuck holds a master's degree in counselor education and a bachelor's degree in psychology, both from the University of North Texas. Anyone interested in contacting Chuck about speaking engagements or contemplative workshops may do so at chuck@thelaudablepursuit.org. Chuck Dunning has authored Contemplative Masonry, Basic Applications in Mindfulness, Meditation, and Imagery for the Craft. And that's what we're going to talk about this evening. Chuck, I'm not going to ask you the usual idiot questions most interviewers ask you, like, why'd you write the book, and how long did it take you to write it, and did you have a hard time getting a publisher? I want to go right into ideas.
All right, let's dive in.
Okay. I kind of think, first thing was just an impression. I feel like I'm dealing with a philosophy within a philosophy.
Mm.
But, Mason and I, we get this because we both do meditation. And I know he does more than that. And I do visualization. Matter of fact, I did some visualization before coming on to look at myself asking questions. But
nice.
I know most Masons do not. I mean, Freemasons join for different reasons. They practice Masonry and for different reasons. They're at different levels of understanding of Freemasonry.
Yeah.
How do we get these Masons that either don't know that this type of contemplative Masonry exists, or they're not prone to practice it? How do we get them involved?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Fred. I think one of the things is that's really kind of interesting, because that goes to a big motivation for why I wrote the book. I think it's important for us to recognize that our ritual actually encourages the practice of contemplation. And so I think just drawing attention to those parts of our ritual and having our brothers think about that. Now, why is our ritual suggesting that we do this thing called contemplation? Why is it telling us that being a contemplative Mason has particular benefits? I think I think that that's a start, is just helping more brothers recognize that this is part of what our tradition is telling us. It's not an innovation. It's not something being grafted onto the craft. It's right there as a suggestion for us to follow up on if we will only do so.
You know, Chuck, many people are scared off by New Age stuff. How do we get Masons to accept what they perceive as New Age practices?
That's a great question. You know, to some extent, I think there are always going to be people, including brothers, who hear the words meditation or contemplation, and they're just automatically going to have that reaction of, oh, this is weirdo, new agey fringe stuff that doesn't really help anybody and might even, make things more confusing. And some of those people will just never be able to reach, and that's okay. I think the people that we can reach are those who can see, for example, that a lot of the methods that I talk about in the book are actually being practiced in very pragmatic ways in all kinds of fields. Like, for example, in Olympic sports and in professional sports, we find athletes using meditative and contemplative techniques to help them improve their performance. The same thing is happening with combat pilots, for example. They actually close their eyes and go into the process of visualizing themselves doing the movements associated with their aerobatics. So those are just two examples. There are all kinds of health applications that are now being used for that meditation and contemplation are being used for, ways that people are using the power of their mind to actually facilitate their own physical healing. And doctors, MDs, are prescribing those kinds of things and encouraging their patients to use them routinely. So these things have kind of moved out of the realm that they used to be in of fringe weirdo stuff and more into the mainstream. And I think drawing attention to that is very helpful in getting Masons to consider what it might offer them.
Now, if I may, people join the Masonic order for many different reasons. You have many different types of Masons that are all bound together. What meditation and these exercises are telling people, from what I'm gathering, is for them to reach deeper, to get a better focus using the tools to expand and dive into the deep end, to use a pretty bad metaphor. Is it something that will fit all Masons? Is it something that will only hit a select group? And how deep can they go?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I'm going to try to stop saying that's a great question, because I know you guys have done your homework, and I really appreciate that. I'm convinced that any Mason who is interested in finding some value in contemplative practice and finding some way of practicing an inner discipline can find something that works for him, that can be useful in making his life richer and more meaningful and deeper, to use your word. That's a very good word. However, it's not something that's going to be of real interest to everyone. And again, I want to stress that that's okay, because one of the points that you guys have both made is that there are Masons that have lots of different interests, and we've got a place in the fraternity for lots of different interests. And the only thing that I would add to that is that whatever your interests are, there's likely to be some sort of contemplative practice that can enhance your experience of that. So, for example, maybe you're the guy that likes cooking the meals for your lodge's dinners. Well, what would it be like for you to actually practice mindfulness of the fact that you are doing an act of love for your brothers as you're preparing that meal, and to put that into your experience and just think about that as you're performing that service? That's a very simple little thing. And a lot of us do these kinds of things very naturally. It doesn't even cross our mind that it's something that we could do more intentionally.
Chuck, to follow up on that, you say in the book that the ritual talks to us in conscious and unconscious levels. Is that what
Yes.
Is that what you're saying, sort of?
There's definitely a connection here, Fred, because consciously, I mean, we hear the words and we understand their meanings in some way, the definitions of the words and the meanings of the phrases and so on. And often we're given explanations for those things. Those are all the ways that the ritual can work on us consciously in the moment. One of the ways that ritual works on us unconsciously is particularly when we go to the trouble to memorize things, or when we have a ritual experience where there's a complete involvement of our being. So physically, emotionally, intellectually, we're right there, and the ritual is demanding something from us on all those levels. Those things can form memories that continue to turn and roll in the backs of our minds. And brothers that have been around for a while, I think we all know what this experience is like of how you're just kind of going through the ritual, or you're just going through your ordinary day outside of lodge, and something about it suddenly comes to you and it gets your attention about how it's meaningful in some way, or how it applies to your life in some way. And that's one way that I'm talking about, that the ritual speaks to us at unconscious levels.
Mason, did you have a follow-up on that?
No, I was talking about the ritual is so formalized,
yeah,
that it borders on set in stone. I mean, this practice, how formal can it be presented where it would be effective?
I'm not exactly sure I know what you're asking there.
Well,
Fred.
I mean, how to. We are taught in the lectures, we're taught in the degrees, a story in a certain set pattern.
Yeah. Yes.
To understand them through meditation and understand them through imagery and all the rest, is there a formal path so that we get the right meanings?
No, I don't think that there is. I think that one of the things that we're trying to do here is to provide a technology and methods for brothers to get deeper insights of their own. Now, those insights may be shaped by all kinds of things that they're involved in, by things that they read, by people that they know, by their own life experiences. But it's very clear in many jurisdictions, our ritual explains to us that we need to travel. We need to look beyond what the ritual explains to us about its own meaning to understand deeper what Masonry can be in our own lives. And so with this contemplative practice, we're actually trying to start moving in that direction. The idea that we're no longer looking for a formula of answers to questions. We're no longer looking for something that all Masons will have to agree upon, but we're looking for, how can I take the things that all Masons agree upon and find deeper personal meaning and application in my life?
Moving on, Chuck, we will be highlighting many quotes from your book and asking you to comment, explain, and expand on them. The first quote is, "All the social and moral virtues of the ideal Mason can only manifest through a properly prepared instrument, and that instrument is the psyche." And with that, does the discussion of the psyche, the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects of it fit in with that quote, or is it apples and oranges?
No, they actually do fit together very well. Because the psyche can be understood as having within it different dimensions or different aspects. So, and you listed them off: the physical, the emotional, the mental, sometimes I refer to it as the intellectual, and the spiritual. And so the psyche as a whole has all of these different dimensions or these different aspects. If we focus too much on any one of those, then we get an imbalance. We don't have the whole working together in harmony. And this is one of the things that Freemasonry teaches us. It teaches us this through telling us about what makes a lodge actually function well. And peace and harmony are the chief conditions of a lodge. For a lodge to function properly, peace and harmony have to be maintained. The same is true for the human psyche. We're looking at how Freemasonry is using the lodge as a model for how a human being should be, and or could be. And so when we get all of those different aspects of our psyche, of our being, working together in harmony, then we are more capable of doing all of the things that we aspire to do as a Mason. So, for example, if I'm just an intellectual type, if I'm only interested in ideas and analyzing things from a purely rational point of view, then my ability to be compassionate, to be able to sense a brother's need for relief, for example, can be diminished because I'm not giving enough attention to those emotional aspects of my being. So that's just one way in which bringing all of those parts together in harmony makes it possible for us to fulfill the big vision of what a Mason can be.
Okay, and another quote. I like this one. It's short and sweet, but it's got a lot of stuff packed in it. Quote, "The unconscious is actively engaged by Masonry." Wow. And does that fit in with also a discussion of holistic maturation, or is that apples and oranges?
No, again, I think that they definitely do fit together. So basically what I'm saying there is that Masonry works in ways that dig into our psyches that are independent of our decision to think about things or pay attention to things. Like I was saying earlier, for example, that process of things rolling in the back of your head, and then one day it pops up and you've made an association that you didn't consciously try to make. It's just all of a sudden there. That's the result of an unconscious process that was begun by an experience in lodge. So that's one way. And another way is through the use of symbols. Whenever we use a symbol, there are different ways to derive meaning from it. And one of those ways is to look up answers to what a symbol means, to look at the way symbols have been used in other settings and situations and to find meaning in that. Oh, well, if it was used over here in this way, then maybe over here in this way it has some of that same meaning. And so how does that affect its presence there? But then there's this other aspect of symbols, and that is that they're not collections of letters and they're not collections of words. Well, those too can be symbols, but we're speaking more specifically here of visual symbols that we experience in lodge, like the square and compasses. Those things are used in ways that are metaphorical. We talk about all of our tools in Freemasonry and use them metaphorically to talk about virtues. That immediately opens the door to taking something that has a very specific literal meaning and giving the mind an opportunity to say, well, I wonder how that very literal meaning could become symbolic in different ways, how it could be analogous to other parts of my life. And that then is something that happens very powerfully in the unconscious.
So you're saying that symbols are like a roadmap, but with a common destination for everyone. I mean, the symbols are pointing in a direction, but it's pointing in the same direction for everyone. Maybe I'm oversimplifying that.
Yeah, I would say that to some extent they are pointing in the same direction. I would also say that it is possible for very unique insights to occur as a result of different individuals spending time with the same symbol.
And you say in your book, Chuck, and it's part of a quote because of the discussion we're doing, that symbolism is the means by which the archetypes hidden within the unconscious can shed more light on our conscious lives. If you tell me what an archetype is, I'll probably understand this better.
Sure. So basically, the word archetype means principle, form, arche, principle,
Right.
or first, and then type being form. And what that term is used for in a psychological sense is the idea, the theory, most famously associated with Carl Jung, that there are these things, for lack of a better word at this point, so I don't just keep using archetypes over. There are these things that exist transcendent of individual human minds that shape how a human mind develops and who that person becomes, how they behave, how they think, the things that they're capable of doing in this world. In the same way that maybe a seed and the genes within that seed determine how that plant is going to sprout and manifest and what it's going to become. There's an analogy there. Archetypes themselves are not physical things. They're things that exist in consciousness, transcendent of the individual human being. And so one of the things that Carl Jung said, and he's not the only one to think of things along these lines. There's also Plato and Pythagoras and the Kabbalists all had their own theories that are very, very much along the same lines of archetypes. What he said and what these other traditions say is that symbols actually serve as a means of reflecting to us certain potentials that exist within archetypes. So for example, when we look at the square and compass and we see that letter G in there, and we know that G stands for geometry and it stands for God, then G, the letter G, begins to represent the supreme archetype, the archetype that is the begetter of all archetypes. And so just looking at the letter G reminds us of that thing that is beyond all things. And in being reminded of that, we open our consciousness to be more aware of it in some way. So that's one way that symbols act as kind of portals or reflectors of archetypal energies and archetypal principles in our own consciousness.
Okay. And another quote from the book for you to expand on. This Masonic path of developing toward the ideal of a truly adult psyche is communicated in many ways, but perhaps most clearly and specifically by referring to the cardinal virtues: prudence, fortitude, temperance, justice, faith, hope, and charity or love. Flesh that out for me.
Yeah. So if we look at, if we try to look at most philosophical and spiritual traditions have some model of what they think the ideal human being is, what the potentials are of the ideal human being, and how to fulfill those potentials. Masonry most clearly speaks of that through the cardinal virtues. Masonry says, look, here are 4 cardinal virtues, 3 theological virtues. These 7 virtues combined, if you will make the changes in your behavior and in your ways of thinking that correspond to these different virtues, that will transform your life, and it will enable you to serve humanity and to serve your Creator more completely, more fully, more effectively. That's Masonry's clearest statement, I think, about what the work of Masonry is. And you know, we use this definition about a peculiar system of morality, that to try to give a shorthand elevator speech about what Freemasonry is, that we've got this peculiar system of morality that we're trying to make ourselves better with. Well, I'm just saying that if we practice those virtues in a very contemplative way, we'll get more out of that experience, and it will have this effect on us of uniting and integrating all these different aspects of our psyche. Because each virtue is not just a behavioral thing. It's not just an emotional thing. It's not just an intellectual thing. It's all of those combined,
right,
as well as spiritual.
Do they affect the person at different stages? Carl Jung, you mentioned earlier, had said that we all grow in different stages through our life.
Yes.
Do they affect the different stages in different ways?
Yeah, I think that that's probably true. And I think that there's probably some variance from one individual to the next also in how the virtues affect us and where we sometimes have our biggest challenges. I think we all know, there are some brothers who are more challenged by the virtue of temperance than they are by fortitude, for example. And, and so I think being conscious of that, is an important thing, because each individual is unique, and so we are trying to take into account that this is not just a formulaic process that you start here, then that's your next step, then that's your next step, and finally you arrive at perfection. This is more like, well, let's use the example of the perfect ashlar. Anybody who's ever tried to square any solid object, whether it's a piece of wood or whether it's a piece of stone or whether it's a piece of metal, if you've ever worked with your hands to try to make a perfect square or cube out of something like that, you know that you kind of have to take a little off here, and then you feel it and you touch it and you kind of examine it. Maybe you put calipers on it, and now I need to take a little off over here. And it's never just a really mechanical process. We got machines for that. Human beings work in different ways. And so that's also, that we need to keep that in mind when we're working with the virtues.
Chuck, I have 3 quotes from your book that I consider absolutely wonderful, and I want to make sure that we get all 3 quotes in tonight. But the first favorite quote is, in the context of social initiation, Masonic rituals can also be rites of passage. I don't know how many times I've tried to explain that to Freemasons, and I bet you can do a better job at it than I can.
Well, I don't know about that, Fred, but I will be happy to try to say more of what I mean by that. So first of all, what do I mean by social initiation? What I'm talking about there is the basic experience of initiation that all Freemasons have. No matter what you come into the lodge for, your basic experience is that you are becoming a member of a body of men. And in that process, you are forming new relationships. That's a social thing, right? You are interacting with people. You're telling jokes. Maybe people are poking fun at you, or there's some serious conversation about difficulties that brothers are having with their life, and how can we help them out? Or there's something in the community that needs our attention, and what can we do about that? That's the social level of Freemasonry that we all experience. Now, a very important part of that for many of us, and probably to some degree for everyone, is experiencing the initiation as a rite of passage. And a rite of passage is something that has been repeated over and over throughout generations. Really common examples of rites of passage for most people in Western society, and particularly I would say, in the United States and Canada and so on. Graduating from high school, getting your driver's license, getting married, all of these are movements into new circles of involvement with your society. Recognition of you have arrived to a certain extent, but now you've got some new things to do, and being challenged with that. You don't get your driver's license just by filling out an application and then somebody sends it to you. You have to pass a test. And then when you pass that test, in the process of passing that test, you're told, these are some expectations. Once you get your driver's license, these are some things you cannot do. There will be consequences if you violate these rules of driving. And some of those consequences may be very severe. Well, this is true of all rites of passage, where our arrival at that place is celebrated. We're welcomed into the circle of those who have gone before us. They greet us gladly, sometimes also telling us, okay, now it's about to hit the fan. And so we just become more solidly rooted in our society and become more a functional member of our society through rites of passage.
And does the chart you have in your book fit in here? You have a chart on Masonic fraternal relationships where you have a circle for initiation, a circle for membership, a circle for instruction, and then the circle of ritual is in the center, touching on all three of those. Explain that to everybody, why you did that and what it means.
Sure. In fact, I'll be happy to show that picture. See if we can get that on screen.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So what you see there is very appropriate for this particular part of the conversation that we're having here, because in talking about the social aspects of Freemasonry, we are talking about relationships. Society is relationship. And when we look at the experience within lodge and even outside of the lodge room itself, but just within the fraternity, what we see are three different kinds of relationships, basic kinds of relationships that most fraternal relationships fall into, one or more of these. And one of those is just membership, and everybody falls into that one. Everybody who becomes a member is a member. That's one of the ways that we relate to each other. I'm a member, you're a member, together we are members. And then another one type of relationship is the instruction relationship or the teaching relationship. And ritual provides lots of ways in which brothers act as teachers and instructors to other brothers. And then outside of ritual, we have that kind of interaction too. I mean, for those of us who are in jurisdictions that require the learning of questions and answers and the demonstration of a proficiency before proceeding from one degree to the next, you were probably assigned someone, some elder in your lodge, who helped you learn those questions and answers. That was a teaching relationship, an instruction relationship. If you are going through the chairs and you're learning how to perform the ritual, you've got maybe a lodge instructor or a district instructor or a Grand Lodge instructor who is providing guidance and helping you perfect your ability to perform ritual. That's an instructive teaching relationship. And then the third kind of relationship that the fraternity offers every member is the initiation relationship, the initiator relationship. And what the initiator does that's different from just the companion, the rank and file member, just the person who's there with you in the experience of being a member, and different from the teacher or the instructor, is that the initiator is the one who challenges you, who insists that you prove that you have earned the right to advance, that you are proficient. And so sometimes you'll see that the teacher and the initiator come together and they're one and the same, but not always. It's not uncommon in lots of lodges for when a degree is put on that the worshipful master who is challenging the candidate at certain points during the ritual is not necessarily the same man who steps forward, puts on the jewel and hat, and delivers the lectures. And so you can see there's a difference there in the role that they are playing. The initiator challenges and the initiator says, you can pass. That's a different kind of relationship from either the companionship of the member or the teaching relationship of an instructor. We learn a lot from those different kinds of relationships, but ritual is the thing is the place where all of them are brought together and we experience them happening all at the same time. And we have the opportunity to learn about how to engage in each of those three different kinds of relationships and how they can intersect with each other, and then carry that out with us into our lives in the world.
In the instruction part, ritual instruction, there's a long quote I have here, and I'm going to have it. But talking about ritual instruction, you say, because it is holistic, experiential, and symbolic, it taps the unconscious mind more powerfully, which in turn urges the conscious mind to find instruction outside the ritual from Masons and other resources, and to speculate and discover meanings that are beyond literal and even moral interpretations. I cut that quote in half, believe it or not.
I'm kind of known for run-on sentences. Sometimes, for me, that's all a complete thought, and I don't want to chop it up too much.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think one of the essential things that, if I were going to try to distill that down a little bit, one of the things that I'm really trying to communicate is that if we're paying attention to our ritual and we are allowing Masonry to have the effect upon us that it was designed to have, and that's very important, allowing it to have the effect upon us that it was designed to have, then we can't help but be inspired to ask the question, what does that mean? Where did that come from? Why is that there? What can I do with that? Those kinds of questions are speculative or speculative, depending upon your jurisdiction. Those are questions that we're trying to find more meaning. And that's what it means to be speculative. To be speculative is to try to find more meaning, to try to understand more, deeper, more clearly. And so if we're allowing Masonry to have its effect upon us, we can't help it. We can't help but do that. And unfortunately, sometimes we're discouraged from doing that. We all know Masons who have felt discouraged from asking those kinds of questions because it can slow things down. It can prevent us from just learning the rote things to say. It can slow us down. And sometimes there's agendas to get things done really, really quick, and it doesn't matter if we really understand them at a deeper level. And so, I just go back to that basic point. If we let Masonry have its effect upon us, we're going to be speculative and we're going to be contemplative.
If I can interject for a second and go back a little, parts of our degree work where you're hoodwinked, where in the third degree different things happen that are basic fears of people.
Yes.
Does that accentuate the lessons of the subconscious?
Yeah. Yes. And that goes back to one of the things in the quote about it being experiential. Mm-hmm. Because the experience of ritual is experiential, which means we're not just thinking about it, we're not just hearing it, but we're doing it. Our physical body is involved. We are moving. We're being moved. We're being touched. Because that's happening, because our fears are being tapped into in different ways. And that can happen in any degree, right? You're being blindfolded and asked questions, and you don't know who's looking at you, and you don't know what's coming next in many cases. And so there's the emotional side of it. So now we're not just talking about experiential, we're talking about holistic, that other word in the quote. It's experiential and it's holistic. So it's touching us in all of these different ways, through all of our senses, It's touching us emotionally. It's stimulating us intellectually by asking us questions, by giving us explanations for things that we're experiencing and that we're seeing and hearing. And it's telling us to remember to be reverent and to accept that there's something mysterious about life beyond our capability to fully understand. And that then opens us up to the spiritual potentials
Absolutely.
of the ritual. Yeah.
Chuck, one thing I would make a side comment here is that I have found that we get more discussion and more meaning and more delving into the meaning of Freemasonry when we close the lodge room and we go out and maybe go to the pub and have beer and pizza or whatever. To me, it's like in a church service.
Yeah.
Pastor's in the middle of his preaching, his sermon. You don't get up and start asking him questions. But and that's the formality of the lodge and the formality of the church. But the church, many Christian churches offer Bible study.
Yes, or Sunday school.
You're not in a worship service. You're in a more casual atmosphere. You can ask questions. You can have a give and take. You go back and forth.
Yes.
Do you find that to be something that you agree with and experience?
Yeah, absolutely. The best conversations I've had about the meanings of my Masonic experiences haven't been, between the opening and closing of lodge. What happens between the opening and closing of lodge is these very symbolic experiences that then stimulate all of these other aspects of my psyche that I can go outside the lodge and fully experience more freely and to explore more deeply with my brothers. And that's a very important part of this, is the idea that this is not just an individual thing, but it's also a group thing, and that those two parts of this need to be brought together. Between the opening and closing of lodge, we are trying to preserve a set way of providing every brother in the group with the same experience, so that when we go outside of lodge to talk about its meaning, we all know what each other's talking about. We don't have to question whether I experienced it significantly different than you did, or maybe something got left out of my experience than you had. If we're in the same jurisdiction, we had the same experience, and that makes it easier for us to work together to find deeper meaning in it. I think there ought to be more conversations like that. And one of the things that I've been discovering as I go around the country and talk to different lodges about contemplative practice within Freemasonry is that I think that is becoming more common. And it is also moving out of the small little cliques of guys who just would get together at a pub after lodge, or maybe go over to a brother's house or something like that. It's starting to find its way into the lodge building itself. More lodges having time set aside for study groups, having time set aside for even meditation groups, discussion groups about a particular Masonic topic or symbol that are actually being held in the lodge buildings. And I think those are fantastic developments. There's a lot of evidence that that's what our early brethren were doing.
Well, that goes from the early research lodges, where you had a congregation of people that were interested in discussing beyond their shared experience.
Yeah.
But nowadays you have the social networking with the different groups, and
yes,
even us trying to explore deeper meanings, and we can highly specialize depending upon what our interests lie.
Yes.
So we can pigeonhole it rather than not say, well, everybody show up and we'll pick a subject and go with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we can be specialists in our pursuit of deeper insight and understanding and application of our Masonic experience. And I'm really glad that we have the opportunity to do that. That's a beautiful thing. It makes Masonry more valuable to a broader array of men, and that makes Masonry more valuable to society as a whole.
It makes it more desirous of becoming a member because they see a path of shared experience that people value.
Yes. Yeah.
And for my lodge, I operate an esoteric study group, which leads me to my second favorite quote.
Okay.
Quote, however, esoteric and secret are not entirely synonymous. The basic meaning of esoteric more broadly references the inner nature of things, or the actualities and potentialities that are not immediately apparent or commonly understood.
Yes.
And
yeah,
that's right on.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it goes right back to what I was saying earlier about how we're given explanations of things in Lodge, but we're also encouraged to find meanings beyond that. And when we start looking within ourselves, we're going esoteric, because that's what eso, like, as you pointed out from the quote, eso means within. We're going within ourselves to try to find more meaning, and we're going sometimes deeper into studies of other traditions or deeper into studies of science, deeper into philosophy. We're going deeper into things to try to find more meaning. All of that is a form of esotericism in its most basic level, and something that seems pretty inherent to Freemasonry.
Well, the time is running, and I think it's very important that we get into something about meditating.
Okay.
So, Chuck, explain to our viewers, what is the difference between contemplating and meditating?
Okay. You're going to get different answers to that from different traditions or schools of thought. But what I'm doing is I'm using these words in a fairly common form. Contemplative practice or contemplation can be thought of as a kind of umbrella term, because most of us think of meditation as a much more specific and formalized kind of thing, where a person sits down, maybe even adopts a particular posture, maybe puts their hands in a particular way, closes their eyes, does some sort of breathing, and then maybe has some other kinds of techniques that they use with their mind, and in the process of sitting still. I think most of us, that's what we think of when we think of meditation. And so I'm not trying to fight against that. I'm saying that that's one of many ways in which we can be contemplative. So what does contemplative mean? What does that big umbrella term mean? In its most basic sense, it means simply to try to be more aware of something, more intentionally aware of something, and within a Masonic context, to do so with a reverent state of mind, to understand that whatever it is that we're trying to pay closer attention to, whatever it is that we're trying to be more aware of, is also connected into all of the mysteries of existence. That everything has some degree of mystery to it. And there's a deep sense of humility that comes with that I think is one of the hallmarks of people who have truly made a contemplative way of life for themselves, is that they realize that they're not going to have the final word or answer on anything, that everything has some degree of mystery to it. I think Freemasonry is wonderful in reminding us over and over and over again of mystery. And so meditation can be one of the ways that we penetrate into those mysteries, that we try to unravel more of the meaning inherent in our experiences and deeper within existence itself. But not only those formalized ways of meditation, but also just dialogue with another brother. That's a form of contemplation, because we are kind of helping each other focus our minds on a particular thing for the time that we're together. What we're doing right now is actually a kind of contemplative practice, because we're trying to more deeply examine the things that I have said in my book and how they could be relevant to the life of other Freemasons. Study itself can be a contemplative practice. So contemplative practice is a very broad thing, and that's one of the reasons why I think it can be appealing to many more Masons than just saying meditation, that it's all just about meditation.
Well, you throw some other terms out here, and I'd like you to talk about them too. You talk about mindfulness,
Yes.
And reflection, self-awareness, and I like this quote. Mindful behavior is a state of conscious action in which we attend with all of our faculties to whatever it is we are actually doing. The challenge of mindful behavior is to live each moment with conscious intent, reducing the degree to which we behave in habitual, automatic, and unconscious ways. Love that. Love that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's recognizing that consciousness is our basic working tool. That's the work. Consciousness is the working tool. The mind is the working tool that enables us to use any other working tool. And so in order to master the tool of the mind, we should be mindful. A really shorthand way of saying what we mean by mindful is thinking about what you're doing and doing what you're thinking about, all at the same time, and not allowing ourselves to become distracted by other things and keeping all of that automatic, thoughtless behavior as much as possible out of the process. So that's mindfulness. It means really being present in the moment. That's another way to think about mindfulness, is so that my mind is not full of thoughts about the past or about the future, but I am as intentionally conscious about what's going on right now as I can possibly be. Now, sometimes what I need to be doing right now is thinking about the future, planning. Sometimes what I need to be doing right now is thinking about the past, and that gets to reflective practice. Reflective practice is that process of thinking back on our experiences and using that speculative process we were talking about earlier to, okay, what did that mean? What value might that experience have in my life? What kind of lessons can I have learned from that experience? That's basically what we were talking about earlier when we talk about how we gather with other brothers after Lodge and we talk about the things that we've done in Lodge. That's a reflective process, reflecting on things that we've done and trying to find what kind of meaning there might be there.
When I was a Presbyterian, I had the opportunity to preach a sermon. And I preached it about listening to God instead of talking all the time and meditating. And the scripture I used was Psalm 46. Be still and know that I am God.
Right.
How does prayerful behavior factor into this? And meditation and prayer have a lot in common?
Yeah, they do. In fact, prayer is always some form of meditation, in fact, because what you're doing is that you are trying to focus the mind and you are turning within. No matter what kind of prayer that you practice, there is an inward turning that happens to that. You're being very conscious of what you're doing with your mind, and you're focusing it on the most mysterious things about our existence. None of us can truly define God. We can say what we're talking about. We can kind of point in the direction of what we think God is with our words, but ultimately, God remains mysterious to us because the concept of God represents more than the human mind could ever grasp. It would have to be bigger than the human mind in order to be God. If we're talking about something, the usual kind of definitions in Western society, omniscient, omnipotent, the human mind can't grasp what omniscience and omnipotence are. We can abstract that, but we can't really grasp it. You can't. The finite cannot contain the infinite. And so in prayer, when I make that comment about prayerful behavior and remaining open, when we are in prayerful behavior, we are intentionally leaving a part of our consciousness open to the possibility or the reality, depending upon how you look at it, that the divine is right here, right now. That mysterious aspect of our being, that mysterious level of existence that transcends our ability to understand and be fully aware of, is present right here and right now. And I'm going to leave a part of myself open. I'm going to leave a part of myself still, like in 46:10, Psalms 46:10. I'm going to be still in some part of my consciousness to leave a space for some of that mystery to work its way into my being, into my consciousness. That's often where inspiration and intuition, true, deep intuition, come from. Go ahead.
I said it reminds me of a quote I heard the other day. It said that prayers when we talk to God, meditations when we listen.
Yeah.
And I thought that was kind of deep in the sense of what you're just talking about, that moment when you can have that touch.
Mm. Yes, there's a practice in Christianity called centering prayer, and it's a method of prayer. Are you're familiar with it?
I do.
Yeah, good. It's a great practice.
Yeah.
And in centering prayer, the idea is that the entire prayer is about just opening your consciousness.
Right.
That you're not trying to have any thoughts about God. You're not trying to fill your mind with questions about God. You're not trying to have emotional experiences about God. What you're trying to do is get yourself out of God's way, so to speak, and to just be attentive to the presence of the Holy Spirit, however the Holy Spirit happens to be present in that moment.
Absolutely.
And so that's one example of how meditation and prayer are often indistinguishable from each other. And I think anybody who prays meditates, and it could be argued that anyone who meditates prays.
Now, I know that Mason wants to talk to you about the exercises, but
Okay.
I want to get in the third favorite quote
Okay.
of mine in your book, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mason for a long talk about exercises. This quote I really love, and you got some explaining to do here. It is, quote, "It is the position of this book that the lost word is indeed the deepest and most profound mystery of the Masonic art, as well as the greatest wage of a master Mason." Now,
Yeah.
flesh that out for me.
Okay. So what is the lost word? And there have been lots of people that have speculated about that. And what I have found most meaningful in my travels and labors to try to understand what the lost word is, what I have found most meaningful is that the lost word is itself a symbol for the divine. That there are lots of reasons for this, that I look at the lost word for this. In many Masonic traditions, it's said that the lost word is the ineffable name of Deity. Well, ineffable, it's a word that can't be spoken, not because it's wrong to speak it, but because it literally, we're talking about word in a symbolic sense. We're talking about something that is meaningful, but cannot be spoken because we don't have words adequate to speak it. Words are lost to us in trying to speak of it. That helps us understand what we mean by the lost word. We don't have the word to say what that is, the divine, the single word that encompasses everything that the divine is. We don't have that word. It doesn't exist. It can't exist. And then there's also in the Neoplatonic traditions of Greek philosophy and in Christianity, and you also find this in some Jewish traditions that borrow from the Greek. And you could also argue that it's just part of the Jewish tradition itself, referencing the divine as the Word. That's very clear in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, where there is an aspect of deity referred to as the Word. And in Neoplatonic philosophy, that word in Greek is logos. It's actually the word that was used by the Gospel of John, logos. And in Neoplatonic philosophy, logos is referring to an aspect of the divine that actually animates all of creation, that is the point of connection between the Creator and everything that exists. And that if that point of connection, if the logos isn't there, then whatever it was doesn't exist anymore. And so we've got all of this background of the Masonic tradition pointing to the significance of Word with a capital W as representing the divine. But not just the divine in a kind of transcendent, absent way, but a divine that is right here with us right now. And so when I say that the lost word is the greatest wage of a Master Mason, what I'm saying there is that through the practice of Freemasonry, and particularly through a contemplative practice of Freemasonry, we can become more aware of the presence of the divine within ourselves and in our lives and around us, and become a more capable servant because of that awareness. I'm really glad you asked this question, because I don't talk too much in many of my other interviews about these really deeper spiritual aspects of what Freemasonry has to offer us. But I'm absolutely convinced that this is the most significant part of it. And I think that the most important way that this manifests in the life of a Mason is in how loving he becomes once he recognizes that the divine is in himself, the divine is all around him, that the divine is in his brothers, and that the divine is in every human being. That is one of the most powerful catalysts for a life-transforming experience of love that I know of. And I think that that's why Caritas, that's why charity is the top rung of the Apprentice Mason's ladder. And it's why the last tool that we get when we go through those Blue Lodge degrees is the trowel. It's an instrument of brotherly love and affection. So we're consistently reminded that that's what our tradition promises us, that divine love.
In Massachusetts, the second reading for the second degree from the Bible is 1 Corinthians 13.
Yes. My favorite chapter in the New Testament. I absolutely love that one. Yeah.
Mason, you wanted to say something about exercises now.
Well, wow, give me a heck of a transition here, because I'm enjoying the depth of the philosophical discussion, because I think that's a trying to think of the right word, catharsis, that we all go through when we dive into Masonry. It's a shared experience up front, and it's a learning experience as we go through it, and to the point of the tools come in a certain order, like you just said, and the way that the order hits helps you grow.
Yes.
Which now to get into your exercises, because the book seems to be a beautiful discussion in philosophical growth, and then sort of a handbook on how to go about it. What I think I've talked about this before, that people who get involved with things like meditation. I was talking to Fred earlier about this before we talked to you. People by just the way they are addictive in nature. And if you get into meditation too much, or if you get into prayer too much, like you said earlier, you give up. If you get too heavy in one area, you give up things,
That's
even
right.
though it's very important.
Yes.
You suffer over here.
Yes.
And I notice the exercises are incredible. They lead you, to use a very bad metaphor again, wading in the shallow end of the pool and swimming to the deep end. It is a wonderful way of doing things. I'm curious though, is how does one moderate these exercises so that it can consume you to a point of education and growth and realization, but not overconsume you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think one of the things that I have tried to do in providing guidance through the exercises is to say, okay, do it this many times over this time period, to try to provide some guidelines on a level of practice or a degree of discipline that can be constructive without being too consuming, but is also not so lax that you miss some of the benefits by just watering it down. That's not an easy balance to strike. And it's also kind of presumptuous to say that the balance that I decided on would be perfect for anybody. So I don't want to make that claim.
I wasn't accusing.
I appreciate that. I think one of the important things here too is to just keep in mind essentially what you were saying, Mason, and that is that that one of the basic teachings of Freemasonry is kind of keeping things in proportion, trying to find a working harmony, and paying attention, being mindful, to go back to that word, being mindful of, is my practice, is my meditative practice or my contemplative practice starting to hurt other aspects of my life? One of the problems, one of the challenges with that question is that, like anything that can become addictive, is it feels wonderful sometimes, and it feels like, well, like, there can't be. I mean, more is always better, right? And you can begin to justify, okay, well, I can let go of that. That's not so important, or I can let go of that. That's not so. And before you know it, you've let go of things that would actually support your ability to be able to do this contemplative stuff. But we see people go to extremes like this in Masonry all the time. I mean, I think most of us that have been in the craft as long as you and I have, Mason, have seen brothers that went too far in their devotion to the offices of leadership and committee work and so on. And we even know brothers that they ruined their family lives as a result of that extreme. So being mindful of it, I think, is one responsible way to try to moderate things. And then I also think this is a very important point in making the argument for why it is valuable, helpful, advisable to work with someone who has gone this way before you, to work with a person who has experience doing contemplative practice, who can help you be more objective about whether you're going off the deep end or getting too extreme or too deeply involved, and to the neglect of other important things in your life and getting out of balance without recognizing it. There's value to doing these exercises alone, but they should never be done just alone. We should always include other people that we respect and whose judgment we consider to be wise in these processes, and have their input and get them to reflect with us on what we're doing.
So every time a Mason goes to lodge, you're not recommending that he do an exercise.
I'm so glad that you asked that question, because one of the things that I have realized since I wrote this book, and I originally wrote the exercises, 17 years ago. One of the things I've realized since I wrote this is that brothers can read this book and get the impression that I'm saying you should only use lodge time for contemplative practice. As soon as lodge is over, get the hell out of there. Don't socialize. And while I give some instructions on some exercises to do that for experimental purposes, that's not what I am encouraging for every experience of the fraternity. In a broad sense, I think every experience of the fraternity can be contemplative in some way. But I don't think you should make every experience of the fraternity some sort of really disciplined, meditative kind of state of mind, because then that's a kind of imbalance. If I'm trying to be so intellectually focused and using the force of my will to shut out all these other things that could be happening in the moment, then I'm creating a kind of artificial experience rather than the natural experience that Masonry offers us. And boy, doesn't Masonry teach us over and over again that nature is our best teacher.
Talking about balance, I have a good friend in the Grand Lodge of Vermont, Brother Errol Hinton, and he wrote a paper many years ago, and I quote it all the time about this balance. He talks about a milking stool, a three-legged stool to milk a cow. And you know that the tenets of our profession are brotherly love, relief, and truth. So each leg is one of those. Now, if one leg is longer, that is practice more, then the stool tips over and you're out of balance. And I just think that's great. That's just an analogy. So you're talking about a balanced position here as far as contemplative Masonry and the practice of it and meditation and all that. You need to be in balance, right?
That's one of the consistent principles that, and I talk about it in the book. And this is, and I actually reference Scottish Rite because Scottish Rite is such a big part of my Masonic life. That we're taught so much about the importance of equilibrium. And equilibrium in the Scottish Rite is ultimately talking about the same thing that we're talking about in the Blue Lodge under the name harmony. And so, I think that that's something that will always be helpful to us, that harmony or equilibrium is a principle that helps us bring order and into all of these different aspects of Masonic experience.
If I can, you talked about the Scottish Rite. Has writing the book, this might be one of those questions you don't want to hear, in writing that book, and
I didn't ask it.
I know. In writing this book, it changed you. I know that in writing books, I know that from personal experience that it changes you because it forces you to think and it forces you to focus.
Yeah.
Did that have any effect on you in your Scottish Rite career and like forming the Academy of Reflection or things like that? Or
yes, absolutely. So one of the things that happened is that I anonymously published a manuscript of those exercises back in 2000, and I knew a bunch of guys well enough that we kind of had an online group where we would talk about our experiences with those exercises together. And I started to develop a reputation as a kind of teacher of contemplative practice and meditation. And I had been teaching outside of Freemasonry, but I started to develop a reputation within Freemasonry of being able to offer that experience. And I got involved in the Valley of Guthrie, and Bob Davis and Jim Tresner there recognized that that I could be a meaningful member of the education committee, not only because of my love of research and writing about Freemasonry, and particularly about Scottish Rite Freemasonry, but because I was a contemplative, that a lot of my research and a lot of my writing was influenced by my contemplative practice, and I could help brothers understand how to do contemplative practice and how it would be beneficial to their Scottish Rite experience. So kind of informally, I did that. As I worked on the education committee, I would occasionally provide a meditation, lead a meditation, and the brothers just started asking for more and more and more and more. And we then finally established a schedule of meditations for each reunion. And then guys were saying, okay, well, this is great during the reunions, but what about between the reunions? You know, you're not here in Guthrie, you're down there in Fort Worth, Texas. And so what can we do? I mean, how can we continue to learn and grow in our contemplative practice as Scottish Rite Freemasons? And that's what led to the formation ultimately of the Academy of Reflection, which is an organization for Scottish Rite Masons who want to integrate contemplative practice into their Masonic experience. And so in 2012, the Sovereign Grand Inspector General, the illustrious Joe Manning, the Orient of Oklahoma, issued a charter for the Academy of Reflection. We had drafted up some bylaws about how it would work. I developed a curriculum so that anybody who really wanted to pursue a study of contemplative practice within Scottish Rite would have a set of guidelines and instructions very similar to what's in this book for the Blue Lodge, but more advanced in terms of the amount of work, because there's so much in the Scottish Rite, and specifically targeted toward the Scottish Rite. And so the Academy of Reflection has now existed for over 5 years. We've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 36 members, I think, in our academy in the Valley of Guthrie. We're in the process of chartering 2 other academies in California. As soon as they meet those requirements, we'll issue them a charter, and they'll then be up and running as their own academies of reflection. And so, very much of what I did early on with the Blue Lodge in mind has had a profound effect upon my experience of Scottish Rite and what I have to offer in the Scottish Rite.
You were talking about equilibrium,
Yes.
just before that, and there was one quote I passed over, so let me sneak it in here now. You say, if health is Masonically understood as equilibrium, then disease is imbalance or disharmony among physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual dimensions.
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of our conversation has really been about that, hasn't it? The word dis-ease, that word disease actually expresses a state of out of equilibrium that's not in harmony. Dis-ease, things are not flowing smoothly and are not working together well. And so, yeah. And what we're trying to do in Freemasonry is we're trying to identify the ways with which we are not at ease. We're not in harmony with ourselves and with the world, and try to find ways to rectify that.
Now, before we go, I just need one explanation of AUM. How do you pronounce that? O?
Yeah, in contemplative and meditative traditions, that's typically pronounced Om.
Okay.
Yeah, so sometimes it's just Om with a long O. Sometimes you'll hear the A a little bit and the U in it, Om. It can be pronounced differently, but yeah, that's what we're talking about there.
Okay. All right. Well, Chuck, we're nearing the end of your wonderful interview. I'd like to ask you if there's anything that we didn't touch upon, and any question we didn't ask you that you would like to bring out? Because we sure want everything out here in the open on this interview.
Well, actually, I think, most of the things that I had wanted to make sure got said have been said. Let me kind of review some of those points. I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking, that the title of this book, Contemplative Masonry, I am making the claim and trying to show evidence from the ritual itself that Freemasonry wants us to be contemplatives, that the tradition of Freemasonry encourages us to be contemplatives. But that's not what makes us Masons. What makes us Masons is the obligation. And therefore, whether a brother considers himself a contemplative or not, whether a brother intentionally engages in contemplative practice or not, he's still my brother. We're still on the level. And I want to emphasize that because in my career, I've seen how easy it is for Masons who are particularly excited about one aspect of Freemasonry to become overzealous, to become a little too fervent, and
Look
a little
down
too,
your noses.
yeah, and think this is real Masonry, and what those other guys over there are doing is not. And I want that to be the furthest thing from what contemplative Masonry is about, what this book is about.
Thank you.
Yeah, that I think that's probably a good place to end, because I've talked a lot about how important I think love is. And if we're really going to embrace love as Masons, then we can't put up those kinds of barriers between us. Mason,
do you have any parting comments?
No, I've been very impressed, and I enjoyed the book. And I mean, I'm speechless because it really was educational for me, both this and the book. So I'm very happy, and I look forward to a future relationship with dealing with the subject matter and the author.
Thanks, Mason. I really appreciate that. I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying to Mason that I look forward to that too.
And one parting comment from me, because, I get asked both by Masons and non-Masons alike. You say you make good men better. Well, how do you do that? Prove it to me. And, I know a lot of Masons that we do the charity work and they haven't got a clue. You have written a book right here that can make a Mason a better person. And it should be something that all Masons at least read.
Thank you.
And you've got a path to becoming a better person, a better Mason, and I applaud you for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. When I signed this book, most often my comment in signing a book for someone is, I hope you find something useful here. And that's it. I hope that this is actually useful to brothers so that they can make their lives better.
Well, that's all for now.
This is Mason Pratt.
And Frederick L. Milliken.
Parting on the square.
Potts.